Allison Agu. I'm professor of adult and pediatric infectious diseases here at Hopkins, but this is one of my prize
Hopkins.
roles, which is the director of the
We get so many trainings from Hopkins too.
programs. I'm going to make sure everybody please mutes so we don't have any disruptions. All right, next slide, Marina's. So a bit about JHM Wiki, if you've attended this toolkit before, we are the Johns Hopkins Medicine collaboration with Wiki for HIV excellence across Central Maryland, and we represent several programs, 6 distinguished ones actually, between the University of Maryland, Sinai, as well as here at Hopkins. And our goal is really to focus on women, infant, children, and youth as populations that have had challenges with HIV, to achieve a more coordinated response to HIV, establishing beneficial relationships that increase the quality of care that we provide as a community. The goal of this is really to build upon our existing infrastructures that we have to create a dedicated network that focuses on that population and really work on multidisciplinary systems of care. Overall, this is our signature series to engage and amplify experts. And when I say experts, I'm not talking about just myself, but I'm looking across the room, the virtual room, because there are experts among us. And so if you see something, we want you to say something. We'd love to hear from you as we'd like to amplify your voice. And really do want to highlight our funder, HRSA, with that grant number. Next slide. So today I am beyond excited to have our speaker, Angelise Evans, who's Senior Manager of Community Engagement at Turnaround. She did a training for us, and we immediately thought she had to come and participate in the Toolkit series, because again, you see expertise and you share expertise. So Angelise is a facilitator and trainer with 15 plus years experience in the prevention education field, specializing in subject matters that range from sexual and intimate partner violence, child abuse, to intersectionality. She also has honed her advocacy skills through coalition building, legislative awareness, programming, and professional and youth leadership development during her work with survivors of abuse and those who experience multi-layered trauma and housing instability. She holds a bachelor's in social work from Morgan State University, the Morgan State University, and currently serves as senior manager of community engagement and training at Turnaround. Angelise, it's our pleasure to have you. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you all for having me. I'm incredibly excited to be back. I really enjoyed the in-person time I had with the JHM staff. So I will be sharing my screen. I do want to check in a little bit on just how I sound and all of that. We
You
were
sound
having
great.
Okay, great. I do want to name that I do have a backup hotspot available. If I go out, I will get right back in and I'll get right back to it if you all lose me at all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay with everyone.
Definitely.
All righty. All right, and I just want to get this into present mode. Okay, so I have the slides that I'll be using today is via a website called menti.com. That website is displayed at the top of the screen. I would love for you all, if you are free, if you have a mobile device near you, if you're able to open up a second tab on your screen currently, to get activated by engaging with this presentation today by joining me at www.menti.com. And once you get to that website, you'll be able to join virtually this presentation with a code. And that code is also reflected at the top of the screen, 3249 1673 3249 1673. And Allison, if you could support me by dropping the website in the chat and the code when you have a moment so people can copy and paste. But this is going to present opportunities for you to join me with some points of engagement. I highly recommend, if for any reason you cannot get connected to the website, please feel free to just drop responses as I prompt things to you all in the chat, and I'll monitor that as well. But in the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Please note that the website, menti.com, and that code you can use are on every slide moving forth. So it'll be present and we'll get it in the chat if it isn't already momentarily. All right. I want to briefly stop and just give a quick trigger warning. Depending on you all's professions, things that you're seeing on a daily basis, you may have a high tolerance for hearing certain things and interacting with clients and so forth. But at Turnaround, we do not start any presentation without a trigger warning. I've listed just a few things that you can do in the moment, wherever you're sitting, standing, listening in from today, to take care of yourself in case there's any of my stories telling or sharing or subject or points of our subject matter becomes triggering for you in any way. Objectives, this was reflected on the flyer that promoted today's toolkit series. I'll let you all quickly look over this, but again, you are aware of the objectives we'll be covering, and we can move on to our first activity. But before that, I'll name a little bit about Turnaround Services fairly quickly. I know that folks are joining us from all over, but I am joining you all from a Baltimore-based nonprofit that services survivors of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, as well as human trafficking. At Turnaround, we provide 100% free services, all of which are reflected on the left-hand side of the screen. Anything from trauma-informed and individual group counseling to even working with perpetrators of abuse via our abuser intervention program. If you are in the Baltimore City, County, or Howard County area of Maryland, we are providing services in all of those spaces. The one thing I do want to note is that our abuser intervention program does operate on a sliding scale, but every other service completely free to survivors and those supporting survivors. Before we get into our activity, I just want to check in once more that there's no blockage on my screen. I have the chat up and things like that. So I just want to make sure. All right, thank you. So to begin our conversation today, I want to engage you all with an activity called Client versus Celebrity. The next 5 slides will have a option for you to choose the word client or celebrity as I give a little brief description of someone that you may read and think, oh, this may be a client of Turnaround specifically, or a celebrity backstory. Okay, I will describe the method to some of my madness here at the end of the activity, but I would love for you all to join in via menti.com, code 3249-1673, or to drop your responses in the chat. First one, a young boy was raped by his mother by his mother's childhood friend who held him hostage in her house until he had sex with her. A young boy raped by his mother's childhood friend who held him hostage in her house until he had sex with her. Client or celebrity? And I do want to name any celebrity that I mentioned. They are known to me. I'm not assuming that they are known to everyone, but I will give a little backstory about who they are when I do disclose them as a response. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to move through fairly quickly with these. The few people that had celebrity, you are correct. I'm referring to film
You're breaking up.
Yeah, Angela.
actor and director. Am I breaking up?
Yeah, you're breaking up, Angela.
Okay. Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop for one moment and I'm gonna transfer over, okay?
Sounds good.
See.
Those who are just joining, we are waiting for Angela to switch over her hotspot, because she's having some dragging. So give us a little bit of patience.
Alrighty. So sorry about that, everyone. Excuse me. Hopefully with my hotspot, we won't have any more delays like that. All right, I'm going to begin sharing my screen again. Okay, so I was given some backstory to this particular first prompt, that it was filmmaker, actor, director Tyler Perry, and I was naming that Tyler Perry first openly spoke about his history of childhood abuse on the Oprah show. Even more recently, there's currently a documentary on his life running on Amazon Prime where he also speaks about this abuse. Our next one, an 11-year-old girl from Texas who was first sold for sex by her parents. An 11-year-old girl from Texas who was first sold for sex by her parents. All right. Most folks are saying client, and you would be correct. So in 2011, Turnaround was the first organization in the state to provide anti-trafficking services for survivors of human trafficking. And one of the roles that I played during that time, while here at Turnaround, I would work with some of our HT survivors as they prepare for court. I met this particular young woman at age 17, going on 18, and she started to describe her history of how she wound up in Baltimore. And one of the things that always stuck with me was the fact that she was actually initially trafficked by her own parents at only the age 11. All right, our next one, a Southern boy pimped out to help pay his mother's rent from ages 9 to 12 years old, who is now a poet. Okay. All right, I see a number for celebrity, and I did do this to kind of throw you off a bit. This person is a poet, but also is a past client of turnarounds, but is not maybe a known poet, very known in the DMV area. There is a program, an awareness program that Turnaround runs in October every month called the Purple Poetry Book. And this particular awareness programming was started by a survivor. Every year, for the last 15 years, we gather short stories, poetry, and artwork, and we put it all into a book that we publish, and we have a release party. This background was told to myself and my staff via a poem that one of our past clients and a locally known poet about not only his history of abuse, but also experiencing deep poverty when growing up from ages 9 through 12. They submitted their poetry piece back in a version of our 2022 Purple Poetry Book. Next one, repeatedly raped by an older cousin from ages 9 to 14, resulting in a teenage pregnancy. Repeatedly raped by an older cousin from ages 9 to 14, resulting in a teenage pregnancy. All right. This one is a celebrity. I'm curious if anyone wants to drop in the chat their idea of who this celebrity may be. This is a pretty known, probably all of us know this particular celebrity. So that's why I'm asking if anyone would guess who it may be. Oprah, yes. Thank you. It is Oprah, and the way that I try to trip you up is that we know Oprah not to have any children of her biological children of her own, but Oprah is also spoken out on many occasions about her history, also of child abuse from ages 9 through 14 specifically, and did bear a son who lived for, I believe, for about 3 months before he passed on. And our last prompt here, an 8-year-old girl raped by her mother's boyfriend. An 8-year-old girl raped by her mother's boyfriend. All righty. All right. I see that almost everyone who responded, at least here, who was able to respond, answered this being a client. And I think one thing to hone in on this particular prompt, that yes, it could honestly be almost anyone's story because it's so short, not too specific. But the person I am referring to is actually Maya Angelou, the renowned poet and writer. Maya Angelou details a lot of her history of abuse via one of her most renowned pieces of work, a book by the name of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I ended with this particular prompt, Maya Angelou being the celebrity that I'm referring to, because in 2011, when we did start offering services to human trafficking survivors, one of the other things that I did was run groups in our drop-in center with our often young survivors. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in that space was create opportunities and perspective for our survivors to see their lives after their extended abuse, right? And originally, this particular activity was called Prostitute versus Poet. And I have obviously changed the language to just be more aware of how those words can be triggering for folks. But it was during that time, it really was a powerful space for survivors to be able to kind of imagine life after experiencing what they had up until that point and engaging with turnaround. So it has morphed into this activity called Client versus Celebrity, really showcasing to our survivors at that time that you could have any type of background and still have a different future ahead of you. And I like to pull in our audiences as we start to talk about human trafficking by opening up with this activity oftentimes. So thank you all so much for engaging in that. And we'll get into some content now. All right, so what is human trafficking? So human trafficking is also known as trafficking persons. Some people may even refer to it as modern day slavery. It is a crime that involves the illegal transport of individuals by force or deception for the purpose of labor, sexual exploitation, or activities in which others may financially benefit. Just to hone in on this definition a little bit more, the pressure can be subtle or overt, meaning that a trafficker, it could be subtle ways that they pressure someone into being sexually exploited. It could be by physical force or some type of psychological abuse being at play. I do want to hone in on the fact that the exploitation of a minor for commercial sexual exploitation is always considered human trafficking, right? Regardless of whether or not there is force or fraud or anything like that taking place at that time. All right. Oh, so sorry. Let's go into talking a little bit now about the different types of human trafficking. So oftentimes when we are speaking about human trafficking, that is more of a broader term. And then you get into specific ways on how trafficking actually shows up in practice. Sex trafficking being one of them, and it's very specific to the type of human trafficking clients that we see here at Turnaround. We work primarily with sex trafficking victims as well as labor trafficking victims. So sex trafficking is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. One thing I want to highlight with this slide is just recognizing, and as I share different information, please recognize the years of which these acts have been enacted. One thing about all of our victimizations, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, you're really seeing more legislation and things like that come into play for for intimate partner violence in particular, as far back as the 70s, but still as early as the 70s. And really, as it pertains to sexual assault and human trafficking for sexual assault, you'll see that more really immersing itself in the late 80s and 90s. And sex trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, a lot of those laws have really been enacted in the 2000s and so forth, right? So it's still a very developing topic, and we're still trying to find ways to create more structure around how we prosecute, recognize prosecute traffickers, and recognize victims. All right. So some common indicators that you could look out for if you suspect that sex trafficking may be occurring: frequent movement of a person to different locations, often between cities or states. If I go back to that client that I named working with in 2011, and how this person starts off at 11 years old and they wind up all the way in Baltimore from Texas, and now 17 going on 18, right? The victim may be dressed inappropriately for their age or for the physical environment. They also may mention being forced into commercial sex work, or working in environments like strip clubs, massage parlors, or even escort services. Now, moving on to labor trafficking. So labor trafficking is when individuals perform labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Labor trafficking includes situations like debt bondage, forced labor, or involuntary child labor. Labor traffickers use violence, threats, lies, or other forms of force to force people to work against their will in many industries. Now, some indicators for labor trafficking. This person may be working excessively long hours without breaks or inadequate pay. Employment in industries known for trafficking risks, such as agricultural, construction, domestic work, or manufacturing. You may even see some of this occurring as you engage in soliciting services and stuff like that for your home, office space, or whatever you may need. And then a dependence on the employer for housing, food, or transportation. So for example, if we even went back to the definition of labor trafficking and we're talking about debt bondage. So if you are offered a job and you are supplied housing, food, transportation, and then you go to leave that job, and now all of a sudden that employer is saying to this person, oh no, you owe us because we provided housing for you, we provided food for you, we provided transportation. All right. So at the end of each section, or midway through a section, just to break up the monotony of the content, I have some learn checks. So I would love for you all to look to the prompt. The exploitation of a minor for commercial sex is human trafficking, true or false? Or you can drop a T in the chat, or an F in the chat, or true or false in the chat if you cannot engage with the Menti website. All right, this one was true. Again, and even more in layman's terms, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. We know that in the US, at least, prostitution is considered illegal. So a lot of our survivors that we serve in particular, they do often come with backgrounds of prostitution because it is not being deciphered that they are actually a victim of trafficking. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about types of traffickers. So there are many that we can kind of go and speak about, but I like to highlight 4 of them. We have the Romeo trafficker, the gang trafficker, familial trafficker, and the survival trafficker. So the Romeo trafficker, if you're just looking at some context clues of the word being used here, what we know the Romeo to be, right? So this is a lover. This is someone who presents themselves as a romantic partner of some sorts. They are usually engaging with someone first by meeting emotional needs. They may go on to engage their partners by being, I would say, maybe somewhat risky or out of the norm of sexual practices. Then moving on to something like inviting a third party possibly into the relationship, and then slowly removing themselves from the sexual act to where the victim is now performing sexual acts with people that the Romeo trafficker has orchestrated them to be with, and there is some type of financial gain in result of that. Okay. Gang traffickers, what they usually are offering their victim is some form of protection. So say if you're living in a high crime, if a victim is living in a high crime area or something like that, a gang may approach them to offer protection and stability in exchange for them engaging in various illegal acts. It could be drugs, it could be petty crimes, it could be commercial sex acts. All right. Familial trafficking is something that we see quite commonly too, even from some of the examples that I gave with those who identified as clients of turnaround in the beginning with the client or celebrity activity, that just like sexual assault, just like intimate partner violence, oftentimes abuse does occur by someone that the person knows and trusts. Right? It is no different when we're talking about trafficking as well, that oftentimes a trafficker may identify as a friend of the family, a family member, or like reflected above, a romantic partner. And then you have your survival trafficker. This is someone who is weaponizing someone's need to meet their basic needs. So maybe providing housing, maybe providing food, maybe providing food or housing in exchange for some type of commercial sex act or some type of labor. I go in on the next few slides with some actual definitions, highlighting with Romeo, usually emotional manipulation, charm is at play. They're leveraging romantic relationships to recruit and control their victims. Again, with the gang trafficker, this is an individual or group within a criminal gang that engages in human trafficking. And then going on to familial trafficking, again, recognizing that parents, guardians, or other relatives often exploiting someone usually younger for some type of financial gain, labor, or sexual purposes. And then that survival trafficking, looking like referring to a situation where individuals are forced into trafficking or exploitation as means of basic survival. All right. And usually I would stop somewhere in here at some point to ask if there are any questions. I am going to reserve time at the end of our time together, the last 10 minutes or so, for any questions that you may have. So please hold on to them, drop them in the chat, and we can even address them at the very end. But thank you so much for staying with me thus far. Going into talking a little bit more about human trafficking as a whole. So in essence, for human trafficking to be defined and occur, a trafficker will have to commit an act, a means, and have a purpose of the exploitation. Breaking that up a little bit more, an act, the act must be one of the following. So recruitment, transporting, transferring, laboring, receiving, giving or receiving a benefit, or establishing some level of control over another person. The means of which they complete these things is usually via violence, the threat of violence, of abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, position of vulnerability. So playing on a position of vulnerability. And then the purpose, as highlighted in some of our previous slide, is to sexually exploit. It is to push forced labor, slavery, things like organ removal, or even forced labor or services. All right, another learn check. Deception is a means for trafficking a victim. Deception is a means for trafficking a victim. All right, I see a T dropped in the chat, and I see a few reflected on the screen. Absolutely. It had a long list, but deception was mentioned on just a couple of slides back as a means of which a trafficker may recruit a victim. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about the scope of this particular issue, the issue being human trafficking. All right. So I do want to put a bit of a disclaimer that in this field, there are a group of people who absolutely hate stats, and then there are a group of people that are like myself, I would say, that utilize them, but I do like to name how inadequate they could be based on, again, just like all of our victimizations that turn around, there is so little. There's a lot of issues with reporting, getting accurate responses to how vulnerable folks may be. So you always want to take some of our stats that are shared with a grain of salt, okay? All right, so the International Labor Organization estimates that there are 40.3 million victims of human trafficking globally. Human trafficking is the second most profitable illegal industry in the US and the fastest growing enterprise in the world. What do you all, if human trafficking is the second, what do you think is the first one? And we're talking about illegal, profitable industries. What do you think is the first? Anyone to drop drugs? Yes. So I want to slow that down, right? So drugs, the number one most profitable illegal industry in the US, and human trafficking, the selling of people, is the second most profitable illegal industry in the US. Okay. An estimated 293,000 children in the US are at risk of becoming victims of sex trafficking. And later on, I want us to unpack a little bit on what puts folks at risk, at higher risk of experiencing something like sex trafficking. Excuse me. There we go. All right, a few more stats for you all. 15 is the average age of when victims are first attacked. 50 to 90% of sex trafficking victims have been involved in the child welfare system. 52% of juvenile arrests for commercial sex acts are African American children. And 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ+, although they are 7% of the population. I like to share that I've primarily always worked with survivors of abuse, specifically the victimizations that I've been naming throughout the presentation. But even in my bio earlier, it also named me working with those who experience housing instability. So for about 2 years, I branched off a bit and I worked with young people experiencing homelessness at a local drop-in center here in Baltimore City, Maryland. And even from my own personal experience, these last two percentages really stand out to me, because if I broke down some of the percentages of the young people we served in that space, so these were young people between the ages of 16 through 24 years of age, that I would say about 80% of our young people identified as African American, Black presenting folks. And I would say maybe a little under that, maybe somewhere between 75, 80% of our young people also identified as being a part of the LGBTQ+ community. All right. So I know that we are that folks are joining us from all over, but I do want to name that Maryland is considered a hot spot for human trafficking in the US. If you are a resident of Maryland and you are familiar with kind of just like our landscape, why do you think that is? And you can drop your responses in the chat. Why do you think like a state like Maryland would be a hot spot for human trafficking to occur? Airports, great. We're already starting off well. If we have airports, what are our other ones? Highways like I-95, highway casinos, great. The harbor, yes, so we have the ports, right? Business center, international hub, absolutely. The highways and the ports are being named again. What else? Let's think about some social dynamics here, too. All right. That was great. Disparities in wealth. Thank you so much, Allison. Yes, clubs. Okay, absolutely. Clubs, gentlemen's clubs. Okay. Large number of immigrants. Great. I don't think I hardly ever hear that named in this part of our conversation. Yes, absolutely. The thing that I'm seeing missing here are sports, right? So we even if we just take Baltimore alone, we have the Orioles, we have the Ravens in proximity to us. We can easily hop on a train or something like that to go to catch a baseball team, catch a baseball game, a football game, a basketball game in Philly. We go down to DC, pretty much do the same thing, right? We can just drive a few hours and go to New York, engage in those things as well. I know the highway was mentioned, and I just want to highlight some of these other major states and cities that are in such close proximity. I say that mostly everything is about 4 hours away. That accessibility to getting to these even more transit areas as well, even though Maryland isn't a pretty transit area itself. Major sports teams, I was thinking that. Absolutely. All right. So, and you all named majority of these things. Easy accessibility to major highways like I-95, I-70, I didn't see mentioned there, but I-95 runs all the way from New York down to Florida, right? So that means you could transport an individual or individuals all the way from New York down to Florida without it ever necessarily catching anyone's eye, right? BWI being a major international airport, but also naming that we have extremely close proximity to Levi Dulles in Northern Virginia, as well as Reagan in DC. Okay. And then you also wonderfully named the ports and the trains and things like that. All of these means of transportation, bus hubs and all of that too. Lots of wealthy people and cities around, lots of people in poverty. So it's an interesting thing about Maryland because as far as my knowledge, Maryland ranks usually somewhere in the top 20 most wealthy states on a yearly average, right? But we also know that it is a state that is also experiencing extreme bouts of poverty, right? And that those things being in contrast does curate a lot of opportunity for trafficking to occur, right? And as we're talking about, I do want to name, as we're talking about risk factors, as we're talking about some of the environmental things, the physical locations, the social, economic pieces to human trafficking, I do not ever want to steer away from the fact that traffickers choose to traffic. So I'm not trying to steer away from that at all, but I am naming some things that escalate trafficking and really and fuel it to occur. The other thing that most folks may not know is that we, as a state, also have weaker sanctions and less protective laws than other states. If I utilize a piece of legislation that Turnaround worked on more recently, so one of the roles that I do play at Turnaround is also supporting our legislative work. Last year, our executive director in particular, had been working on a piece of legislation for the last 9 years, kind of wherever she was at as far as working and bringing that along with her, and then bringing in people like myself to help push that along. Last year, after 9 years, we finally instituted a piece of legislation called the Safe Harbor Bill, which is legislation that essentially grants favor for young people not being to not be charged with crimes of prostitution. Again, earlier I noted there is no such thing as a child prostitute, yet we are still seeing young people in extreme numbers being charged for crimes of prostitution, although even by definition, it should be considered and deemed human trafficking. All right, moving us along. Another learn check. 10 is the average age of when victims are first attacked. 10 is the average age when victims are first attacked. Now, this was a little further back now. We talked about a few things since that particular slide. All right, I see some falses in the chat, and I see majority of falses reflected on the screen, and that would be correct. It is false. For someone who put false, do you want to drop the age? Yes, thank you, Pamela. It is 15. Thank you, Tanya. Yes, 15 was the age that I named. All right, so let's move on to some warning signs as we begin to close out our conversation today. Before we get into the warning signs, who do you all think are at higher risk of experiencing trafficking? Someone earlier mentioned the immigrant population, new American population. So that is certainly one of them. Anything else, what type of backgrounds with these people with these populations have? What are we thinking? This particular slide versus the ones that have previously come does allow you all space to speak in full sentences. So feel free to drop your responses again in the chat, or as you drop them in Menti, we'll see them reflected on the screen. Female runaways, anyone vulnerable situation, age doesn't matter. Trans people, great. Those of low income. All right. All right, absolutely everyone is at risk, but we are speaking to those who may be at higher risk. So specifically, our focus is on the higher part of it versus at risk. Absolutely, as long as we're walking around here, if those numbers as they are as I reflected, we are certainly all at risk though. Physical and mental challenges, absolutely. Foster care, connection to foster care, great. All right. I will get into sharing with you all with the top 5 risk factors, and most of which you all did name either in the chat or that was reflected on the screen. But some general warning signs. You want to be looking for a lack of personal freedom, poor living or working conditions as reflected earlier, no personal identification, which kind of leads into us knowing that those who are part of the immigrant population are at a higher risk, signs of physical abuse, and financial control. Some behavioral warnings: fear and anxiety, inconsistencies in storytelling, isolation, reluctant to seek help of any kind. All right. How do you all think that traffickers find new targets and victims? This will show up in, I think this will allow you to do maybe 1 or 2 words, and it'll show up as like a something called a word cloud. So if the same thing is being said over and over again, the word will continue to kind of get larger. Someone says referrals, word of mouth, malls, online, teen spaces. Where are teens usually hanging out? Internet, social media, right? Online, on the street. All right. Online social media is the #1 recruitment method right? And it is all the social media platforms that we may be engaging in our own time as well, right? Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, Twitch, which are which is a gaming platform for those who may not be familiar. YouTube, Tumblr, dating apps, Discord, also another gaming app. And then you all mentioned a few things like hanging out at malls, food spots near schools. I would say this very last bullet, when we first started working with trafficking victims, was like the number one way, but it's been interesting in being in this work how honestly I would say 90% is being orchestrated online. All right. So jumping back a little bit into what we were talking about of what makes folks a little bit more at high risk, the top risk factors for human trafficking are those who are experiencing recent migration, relocation, those with a history of substance use, which I didn't see named. We did see some folks named runaway or homeless youth. We also saw someone named mental health concerns that they may be managing. And then right at the end there, number one, those who may have a history of being involved in the child welfare system. All right. Another learn check. Social media is a common tool used amongst traffickers. True or false? All right. Yes, absolutely true. Thank y'all for staying with me, staying connected to our content. Let's start to close out about how we can support survivors moving forward, okay? All right, so the main thing, if you do suspect trafficking, you do not want to directly intervene. You may be compromising the person who's being victimized as well as yourself. You do want to, you absolutely want to practice some level of coordination, whether it be through connecting via the national hotline with the local organization that does that particular work, reporting to authorities. But you do want to bring someone else in. It is not something that you should be addressing by yourself because of the high level of danger for the victim and again, yourself. Workplace, just naming in the workplace or state mandated procedures. If you are a mandated reporter, follow your employers and state specific reporting requirements, doing things like documenting observations in a report, notifying a supervisor or compliance officer, and completing required paperwork or forms if you suspect human trafficking is occurring. Just naming really quickly, again, may not apply for those who may not live and work in the area, but turnaround is speaking of acts. So there is the Child Sex Trafficking Screening and Services Act of 2019, again recognized that year. Is an act where it essentially established that local departments of social service and law enforcement who suspect or have reason to believe that a child is a victim of sex trafficking are required to notify their regional navigator within their jurisdiction. Turnaround operates as the designated regional navigator in Baltimore County and Howard County, servicing all genders who are suspected of being trafficked. Each county has a regional navigator, and this is a person that we're referring to. The program is a thing, but there are people who have the title of the regional navigator. All right. Some trauma-informed responses if you are working actively with a client who may be experiencing trafficking. You want to prioritize safety, doing things like assessing immediate risk, practicing confidentiality, referring to emergency protocols internal to your organization. You want to build trust by doing things like being non-judgmental, showing empathy, and being patient. Using trauma-informed approaches, recognizing trauma responses, avoiding re-traumatization, and empowering the victim. So again, you could be actively working with someone who is going to leaving your site and going to be with their trafficker afterwards. Again, if we identified the Romeo trafficker, the gang trafficker, the familiar trafficker, these are people who are entrenched in this person's life. And if they are of age, in particular, meaning over 18, they may choose to engage with their trafficker as well as engage in services. Communicating effectively using plain language when speaking, providing translation services, respecting folks' boundaries, collaborating with other professionals like referring to specialists, working with multidisciplinary teams, and completely avoiding acting alone. You also want to address some of those basic needs. If someone is interacting with a survival trafficker, just by meeting some basic needs, that could remove them from that particular situation. So providing immediate assistance, helping with documentation, supporting long-term recovery. And then just being aware of legal protections, knowing laws, advocating for victims in spaces outside of just the service work, engaging in the political landscape, and legislation. And then also focusing on empowerment, right? Encouraging self-determination, promoting resilience, and for your own sake, practicing some level of self-care, recognizing secondary trauma, and avoiding burnout. I want to close out by offering you all a few resources. Here are some reporting hotlines and legal resources. I'm re-sharing from a previous slide the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and number website is reflected here. Polaris Project is an incredible human trafficking specific website that has just a lot of knowledge, a lot of tips, always updating their content. Please keep that as a resource. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That number is reflected here, as well as the website, as well as the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, Blue Campaign, anything that is government regulated, I cannot speak to. As far as I know, these departments are still operating and well, but I do just want to give an emphasis on, certain things may not be as functioning given the current political climate. The same thing for these particular resources, the U.S. Department of Justice, Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, also a non-government related organization, the Freedom Network USA, a network of legal and social providers. All right, just checking the chat really quickly. All right, let's close out. So a few ways for you to learn more: watch documentaries, read books and news articles. This website here, www.enslaverynow.org, has a wealth of hyperlinked news articles, books, documentaries, and many other resources for you to just continue to educate yourself outside of this space. Attend a community training, which you could check off your list, which you've done today. And I appreciate you all engaging. Stay informed and publicly support policies. Super, super important. Again, 2019, just last year, these laws are still manifesting, and they need all the support around making them happen. And then spending time with survivors, whether that be via just volunteering, donating your time. But yeah, spending time with survivors is also super important, hearing their stories firsthand. My name, again, is Angelus Evans. I currently serve as the Senior Manager of Community Engagement at Turnaround Inc., Baltimore City and County's designated rape crisis center, domestic violence coordination, as well as providing our anti-trafficking services. I'm going to open up space for questions since we have come to the end. We have about 6 more minutes left, but I would love for you to answer me this last question. And no, you do not have an option to say no. Did you learn something new today? Yes. Or if you came with your own level of expertise, please just choose. It was a good refresher. All right, and thank you too for the responses in the chat. All right. All right. And I saw one question earlier about whether these slides whether the PowerPoint will be available. I will look to Allison for that if usually you all ask for a PDF and then share it out at a later time
Absolutely.
with folks. Okay.
Yes.
All right. And
Awesome.
I'm also scanning the chat for any questions.
So, Andres, there are a few questions in the chat. So first, I want to join in the kudos and saying thank you because we saw this training or did some version of a training a couple of weeks ago, and I still learned more. The way you deliver and the way you bring people in with those questions, really wonderful. And then the way you present. So thank you for that. There
Yeah.
are a couple questions in the chat, and please, people, feel free to drop them in or unmute and come on camera so we can see you, so we can hear what you're thinking. But there was a couple. First, we'll start with how do you/staff at Turnaround de-stress from the traumas that you hear about on a daily basis? So that self-care piece of it.
Mm-hmm. I think that Turnaround does really well. Like, not only do we perform trauma-informed care, but it is built into our supervision. It is built into our time outside of work. I think that a lot of us have been working together for some time, so it is a bit like a family and all of that too. But I think I think it's the biggest thing is putting trauma-informed practices into the way that we supervise and support one another, right? So yeah, it is just we are never operating in silos. We are always have someone like with us, like teaming something. I think just beneficially, like the benefits that we have around time off and things like that as well. The offerings of mental health support and all of those things are just super important. So yeah, that decompression is just built in. Like we're doing no meeting at Turnaround is going to start without a emotional level kind of check-in of some type of thing. We're doing chair yoga. We're doing all types of things. So it's just very built in, I think, into the culture. And yeah, and it's interesting because I think when people come in and they are not in that culture, it's like they leave pretty quickly. Like they're like, I can't, do that piece. But yeah. And then also I would even say people have been in the work, stepped away from the work. Even my own journey at Turnaround was there for 5 years, left for 4 years, couldn't really escape it because I started working with homeless youth. So, i.e., my coming back. But yeah, that's usually how we're doing it.
Super important. I think self-care is an action term. It's not
Yeah, absolutely.
noun. There's another question, and happy to have you elaborate on the question. If the person this is from Elvis Montenegro, any tips you can provide to those who are in the process of setting up a restraining order? And it sounds like there may be some offline conversation, maybe that may also be needed. But Elvis, if you want to add any context to that, great. But maybe just maybe take it from there.
Yeah, I would definitely say connecting with a national hotline, depending on where you are, or if you have access to Turnaround to start at least working. I don't know if you're working with a client of some sort, starting to do some safety planning. If you have tools and skill set to do that, I think that is no time like the present to go ahead and start operating around safety planning with this particular person, engaging with, again, an organization like Turnaround or calling one of those national hotline numbers to get specific local resources, because at Turnaround, one of the services we offer is a legal advocate who would essentially take that whole process off someone's hand and see them through obtaining a protective order or some sort.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I do have a quick follow-up question. So,
Yeah.
the client is working um with an agency, but we've kind of noticed that um she has lost a lot of her confidence during this process where she's extra careful, very cautious about everything, all the steps that have to be taken, cautious about going out, always that thought that, someone might be looking out for you.
And I'm sorry, could you restate the question? Any tips on how to like help her restore her confidence? Was that it?
Yes.
What I was gathering? Yeah, I think engaging with some of those last slides of the PowerPoint could be super helpful. I think also introducing some ideas of spaces, group settings where she can join, particularly right with one thing that I usually would share about trafficking victims in particular is that I will say that there is a unique experience on how the healing process looks like for them versus maybe someone who maybe solely experienced IPV or SA, because there is a reacclimating back into society, right? Again, the unwarranted attachment to trafficking is the prostitution element, right? The fact that this is a criminalized activity. So people are coming from that perspective, and I think that recognizing that is super important if you are referring to a trafficking survivor in particular, and finding spaces where they can be in community with people with similar experiences. That's one of the things that we have seen. I will say that post-pandemic, our drop-in center that I named earlier was really robust when we first started it. I mean, I think one of the most beneficial things we saw our clients wasn't even anything that we were doing other than creating the physical space for them to be amongst each other. We saw them, babysitting children when they were going out and getting, applying for jobs. We saw them learning how to cook together. We saw them moving into the same apartment building so they can have support. So I think certainly curating some spaces or recommending some spaces where that person can be in community could be a really good baseline start to building some of their confidence, just because they're aligned with some peers of some sort.
Thank you so very much for that.
You're welcome.
There is a question in the chat that I'm hoping that you can answer, and will that be the last one, and then people can follow up with you. But
Okay.
Pamela Whittle is asking about who has access to turnaround. Do you have to be a city resident, or where do you exist, and how can they
Yes.
connect?
So it is specific to residents of Baltimore City, Baltimore County, which is Baltimore County is pretty expansive. So that's Catonsville, Lutherville, Dundalk, Cockeysville, those areas, Essex, Parkville, Maryland. So that can be pretty expansive when I say Baltimore County, and then Howard County. So that's like Columbia. Unfortunately, I think that may be the only city I don't know in Howard County, which is where one of our offices are. But so it's Howard County, Baltimore County, as well as Baltimore City. But I will say that there are in most of the counties throughout Maryland, there's an organization just like Turnaround there. So and Turnaround, it's not like we do not work across agencies. So say something like getting someone transported into the city or into another city, we work with other organizations to make sure there's like a transfer, like a warm handoff into those other organizations.
Definitely, thank you. And I can
Yeah.
attest that you assisted with a patient of ours that ended up in DC and the like. Not to say more, but that just
Yeah.
the connection is really important. So it sounds like someone may not be in that catchment area, but can reach out to Turnaround, and Turnaround can connect them as well.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, we are over time. Angelisa, that was fantastic. We will be sharing your presentation with the people who not just attended, but those who registered. And then this will be available on our YouTube series, our YouTube site. So really, thanks for your expertise and your passion and your commitment to this work. Really, really critical. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. You all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. All right. Take care, everybody.